Thank you. Thanks very much. And I want to say how thrilled I am to be here in the city that was my hometown for so many years, and to receive this award from the newspaper that in many ways I still consider my hometown newspaper. I'm still a Chicago Tribune reader. Chicago Tribune was the first newspaper in America to review my book, Looking for Alaska, and they were nice about it, which I appreciate. And I remember, Time Out Chicago, I'm looking at you. Just kidding, but seriously. And I'm very grateful for that. This is a great honor for me, and but I want to make it clear that it's not just an honor for me, because books aren't written by one person, and that's kind of what I want to talk about today. When I look back at the last 7 years of my publication career, and more broadly the last 11 years of my life since I became, or started to imagine myself at least as a writer, it becomes immediately clear to me that my books weren't written by me, at least not exclusively. They were written by thousands and thousands and thousands of people, but along the way there are certainly some people who have more influence over the creation of a work of fiction than others. And we live in a world now in which there are many people who will tell you that books are written by one person, and that one person should receive all of the glory and especially the income related to the writing of those books. Specifically, companies like Amazon that will tell you that what should happen is that writers should write their books and then submit them to the Kindle store, and then you and I can buy them as readers, and that way we will cut out the middleman. But I'm here to tell you that there is no cutting out the middleman, because the middleman is essential to the creation of a good novel and to good literary life in America. So I look back and I remember in 2002 or 2001, I guess, 2001, and my editor at Booklist magazine, Eileen Cooper, I was a publishing assistant at the time. I mostly typed ISBN numbers into a database. I was, as Eileen and her husband Bill are here today, and they will tell you that I was a terrible publishing assistant. Truly bad at my job. I really appreciate them keeping me around. And I was a great example of the principle that if you are really bad at your job, but reasonably fun to hang out with, you will eventually get promoted. So that they won't have you in that job that you're bad at anymore, and maybe you can be in a job that you're a little bit better at. But I went out to lunch with Eileen Cooper, and I told her that I wanted to write a book, and I told her a little bit about the book, and she was generous enough to say that it sounded good, and then generous enough to give me deadlines that I failed to meet, and more deadlines and more deadlines and more deadlines, until finally I gave her something that she could read, and then she was generous enough to say that it didn't suck. But that it needed a lot of work. Much of that work she did with me, and in that process, she wrote many parts of Looking for Alaska. I remember there's a part where Alaska flicks a cigarette ash into a pencil holder. Eileen wrote that. That was her idea. It's a great little moment in the book. There's a moment early on in the book that is so popular that a lot of people have it tattooed on their bodies. It's very strange. There are probably people here with those tattoos, so I'm grateful, but as long as you're happy with it, as long as future you is as happy with it as current you, I'm okay with it. I'm just worried about future you. But there's a moment early in the book when Alaska says, imagining the future is a kind of nostalgia. Well, that's something that the woman who became my wife said to me on our first date. There are moments in the book, my friends from high school will be happy to tell you how much they contributed to the book. How many things they did that I, as they would say, stole. And that is all true. It is true that many people, I remember my friend Ben Sagan, who I worked with at Booklist, told me a joke once that I went home and wrote down in Looking for Alaska. I'm completely shameless about this, and I think that writers must be. You know, writing is essentially trying to find a way to use this weird, abstract set of symbols to create a story inside of someone's head that means something to that reader. And in order to do that, I will do whatever it takes. Like, I will steal from anybody. But the story of me not being the only writer of Looking for Alaska and my other work doesn't end there at all, because eventually that book was sold to Penguin, and I had an editor there and a copy editor, and there were many people who were devoted to getting Looking for Alaska to readers. This was back when I did not have 1.2 million Twitter followers. I had none, and when no one had any reason to read my book, when this was pre-personality-driven culture of reading, and all of those people made it possible for me to be standing here today. Now, I'm not going to share the award with them, but I'm very grateful. With an abundance of Catherines, I think of my dear friend Hassan and my friend Shannon, whom I lived with when I was working on Catherines, and the ways in which, and my friend Katie, sorry Katie, and the ways in which they contributed to the book in our conversations, in the way that we lived. The couches that Colin and Hassan sit on are the couches that Hassan bought for us from the flea markets. And when I think of Paper Towns, I think of being in Detroit, walking through abandoned buildings with the novelist M.T. Anderson, and how I could never have written that story if Tobin hadn't taken me to those strange and haunted and beautiful places. So it's very important to me to communicate to you my belief that books are not created by an individual. They are not written from on high in an ivory tower by geniuses. They are made by regular people in consultation with other regular people, all of whom add value to that process. So I really believe, I don't want to sound like I only believe in traditional media, but on some level I only do. I think there is a place in this world for blogs and certainly for video blogs that are made by regular people in their basements, and I'm so grateful that we have made that happen. We have made a space for that. But I don't think that means that we should eliminate the space for voices of authority, for people who have done the work, for people who have been trained in their fields, for people who have the resources and the time to go out and do real, say investigative reporting, or real deep, close editing that makes great novels possible. It is not a coincidence that Maxwell Perkins edited all the great writers of the mid-20th century. They were great because of him, not the other way around. So I promise I will get funnier later, but I'm not actually going to get that much funnier, to be honest with you. So, sorry, suckers. I'm not a funny person, like in my regular life. So my mom worked as a community organizer for many years in Orlando in many capacities, but one of the things that she did was she tried to get services to underserviced neighborhoods in the city of Orlando. For those of you, is anyone here from Orlando or anything? Good. Oh, wow. I'm about to talk smack about your hometown. It's kind of a terrible place to live for a bunch of reasons. But the weirdest thing about living in Orlando is that you're living in like the 13th largest city in America, but there are many unpaved roads and neighborhoods without streetlights because the city government it's never been particularly well funded. It's also never been particularly well run. And so my mom wanted, my mom's work was trying to get very basic services like running water and paved roads and streetlights that reduce crime to these neighborhoods in Orlando that had been neglected by their cities for so long. And I remember right after I graduated from college, I started working as a student chaplain at a children's hospital. I was living in a very small apartment and doing pretty difficult work in a lot of ways because I spend a lot of time with families whose kids were sick or were dying. And when I'm doing that, I had a conversation with my mom where she talked about her frustration that the last 10 years of her life had been spent working against a government that didn't want to work with her, and working with people who often didn't understand her role and felt like she couldn't succeed at what she was trying to do, and in many cases she didn't succeed. And I remember her saying to me, you know, sometimes I feel like I did all of this for nothing. A lot of you here are young, but I promise someday you will feel that way. Hopefully you don't feel that way yet, but you will feel that way, and it's okay. And you did do it for nothing, because here's the thing. We're all gonna die. But the bigger problem, that's a relatively minor problem, really. But there's a huge problem, which is that everyone else is gonna die, and all of their descendants will die, and there will be no human beings someday, hopefully it'll be a while, there will be no human beings left to remember that any of us ever did anything. Like, you've probably read a lot of post-apocalyptic novels, or you've seen a lot of post-apocalyptic films, but the one thing that all those apocalypses have in common is that they weren't apocalypses, because there's someone around to tell the story of the apocalypse. The story of the real apocalypse will be much sadder. It was the most boring movie ever. Nope, there's no one even to film it. And that bothers me, right? Like, my mom's feeling that all this work that she'd done on behalf of this community that she fought for so many years was for nothing, was you know, in some ways a failure. Well, we all have to face up to this, that like all of the buildings that we build, this lovely poetry that we read and write, will all one day be unremembered. And I really think that if you don't reconcile yourself to the reality of that, then whatever worldview you have is a little bit like insufficient, at least to me. I might be wrong about all this, by the way, of course. It's blah, 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 blah. So, at the same time, I was working at a children's hospital, like I said, and I was having to deal with the fact that the universe is very random and capricious and cruel, and that it's very difficult to make sense of the world in a hopeful way. It's very difficult, at least for me, it was very difficult to come to terms with the things that I was seeing, the very nice kids I would meet who would die for no good reason. It was very difficult for me not to feel anything other than anger about that, honestly, to feel anything other than furious and powerless and just pissed off. So you combine these two things that are happening in my life right after I get out of college, and it explains why I was such a terrible publishing assistant, hopefully. But I especially felt this way about cancer, because cancer is such a capricious disease. It is, I think, in many ways, for us, what tuberculosis was to the 19th century. It's a disease that strikes the young and the old. It's a disease that you sometimes die and you sometimes don't, and it's not really clear, like, why or anything. So I started trying to write when I came to Eileen and told her I had an idea for a book. I started trying to write this book. And the first book that I was trying to write was this novel about sick kids and their stunningly handsome 22-year-old hospital chaplain. And that book like never really came together. It was really self-indulgent. I don't even think, I showed Eileen like a short story and she was like, this short story is really good, but there's a little too much of the chaplain in it. And I was like, he's kind of the central character. But then she, you know, and then I ended up working with Eileen on the book that became Looking for Alaska, which was much more sort of unambiguously a young adult novel, and also a little easier for me to get my head around. And you know, with the other story, I felt like I bit off a lot more than I could chew. What I wanted to write was I wanted to write an epic love story. But I wanted to write an epic love story that wouldn't be like most of the epics of our time, which are about like war or, you know, big political strife or family dynamics or whatever. They're about big topics. I wanted to write a little epic, a tiny little epic about the thing that circumscribes almost all human lives, which is disease. And I had a couple inspirations for this, but the biggest inspiration was this poem by George Baugère that I'm going to read to you. And I know that you're not used to the idea that poems can be funny, but this is a funny poem, so you should feel free to laugh. Sometimes people feel uncomfortable laughing because they're like, but poetry is with a capital P. This is called The Return of Odysseus. When Odysseus finally does get home, he is understandably upset about the suitors who have been mooching off his wife for 20 years, drinking his wine, eating his mutton, etc. In a similar situation today, he would seek legal counsel. But those were different times. With the help of his son Telemachus, he slaughters roughly 110 suitors, and quite a number of young ladies, although in view of their behavior, I use the term loosely. Rivers of blood course across the palace floor. I too have come home in a bad mood. Yesterday, for instance, after the department meeting, when I ended up losing my choice parking spot behind the library to the new provost, I slammed the door. I threw down my book bag in this particular way I have perfected over the years that lets my wife understand the contempt I have for my enemies, which is prodigious. And then, with great skill, she built a gin and tonic that would have pleased the very gods. And with epic patience, she listened as I told her of my wrath and of what I intended to do to so-and-so, and also to what's-his-name. And then there was another gin and tonic, and presently my wrath abated and was forgotten, and peace came to reign once more in the great halls and courtyards of my house. That's George Baudelaire, The Return of Odysseus. He can't hear you, but I'm sure he's delighted that I pilfered his copyright. I wanted to write a story like that took kind of inserted teeth into the epic by taking the traditional teeth out of them. And that's the book that ended up becoming The Fault in Our Stars, but I could never write that story until I became acquainted with Esther Earle, a nerd fighter and reader of my books, who I met in 2008 when she already had stage 4 cancer. Esther died in 2010, but over the course of our 2.5-year friendship and coming to know and care for her friends and her family, I was taken out of the stories that didn't have to be about a dashingly handsome 22-year-old hospital chaplain. It could be about the kids. It could be about the people it was supposed to be about, who were the people living the story, and not the person observing the story. And so that was finally the way in. I wanted to write a story that captured, in The Fault in Our Stars, I wanted to write a story that captured the idea that a life doesn't need to be a long life to be a full life. You often hear, like my grandfather died a few months ago, he was 92 years old, and at his funeral people told me over and over again, well, your grandfather lived a really full life. That's true, he did, and he lived 92 years, so it's kind of easy to fill it up. It's a lot harder to live, to say, to go to a funeral of a 16-year-old and say to their family, your daughter or your son lived a full life. But I wanted to make the argument that it is possible to have a full life, even if you don't have a long life, and that it is possible to have a good life, even if you don't have a long life. And that was really, for me, I had to reconcile myself to that. I had to believe that before I could write the novel, or it would have been nothing but nihilistic. But my hope is that I wrote a hopeful novel, a novel that embraces the idea that even though, yes, all of this will be forgotten, not today, and even though, yes, all of us will be gone, not today, and that is why we still have a responsibility to each other, and that is why we still have a responsibility to those who came before us and have died. In this media-soaked world that we live in, it can be very difficult to remember, because there are so many living voices, it can be very difficult to remember that for each of us there are 19 people who have come before us and who died, and that in some ways their lives were lived in the hopes that ours would be lived well, and that we have a responsibility to them, but we also have a responsibility to those who will live after us, and may we be so lucky that there are 19 of them for each of us. This is how I reconcile myself to the world as it exists. I know that sometimes we all feel, whether we're 6 years old or 95 years old, we all feel like we're tilting against windmills. We all feel like the work that we're doing is for nothing, or that it's underappreciated. We all feel like we have to navigate bureaucracies that we shouldn't have to navigate, and do work that maybe we don't feel qualified or even able to do. But the truth is, I believe that little epics and little lives matter as much as the so-called big ones, and that in fact the so-called big lives aren't particularly big in the end, that each of us has a little epic, and that little epic is important and that it matters. And I believe that the daily business of being kind to each other and trying to do good work, even amid all the frustrations of that work, even amid all the setbacks, even amid standing in line at the grocery store and waiting in traffic and the other myriad things that attack us on a daily basis and ask us not to believe and not to care, that amid all of that stuff, that we are doing grand and noble work and important work, all of us. And that's what helps me to get out of bed every day. Thank you.